Hi and welcome back to the channel. As you can tell from that little intro I did, we are still in lockdown here, and it's been about 25 years at this stage, and so I thought it was time for me to do a comfort movie. Just sit back, go old school, enjoy something from the past that turned up pretty much every time Father's Day rolled around on television. Now, I have a very fraught relationship with Father's Day as a concept, but leaving that aside, The Dirty Dozen is definitely a favourite. It's one of those old school war movies that people like to watch when they're in the mood for a World War II film. Yeah, you can put it in the same bag as things like The Great Escape, Guns of Navarone, maybe, possibly Ice Cold in Alex, which if you haven't seen, you should check out. If you want me to review that, let me know. There are so many World War II movies, which I find an interesting phenomenon for a number of reasons. Firstly, one of the things is that a lot of the audience for the World War II movies that were turning up in the late 50s and early 1960s, and the early 50s as well, were the people who actually had lived experience of World War II as soldiers. There was a narrative there that they were celebrating their success, and there was a recognition there of the things that they sacrificed and the steps they had to take to defeat Nazis and the Empire of Japan. So in a sense, there was a celebratory aspect to a lot of these war movies at the time between, say, 1950 and 1970. But toward the end of that, the narrative shifted and movies started to take a more nuanced look at war and exactly how nasty it is. The celebratory aspects of it were dying in film, and people were making parallels between World War II and Vietnam, and so a movie like The Dirty Dozen was made. Robert Aldrich, who made it, had been very successful with a number of other films, including some World War II movies, but in 1967 you couldn't just go along with that gung-ho World War II spirit kind of thing. It was around the same era that John Wayne made The Green Berets, which celebrated the American invasion of Vietnam. And so there was a lot of politics involved in the 1960s. And then along came The Dirty Dozen, which took a very different look at certain aspects of war, and it took a very different viewpoint of the Americans in World War II. Lee Marvin plays Major John Reisman, an army officer who is given a very unusual task. He's to take 12 prisoners who are on death row in some cases or have very long sentences for violent crimes, train them up and to basically take them on a suicide mission. These guys are the basis of movies like The Suicide Squad. They are the original Suicide Squad. I mean, let's take a look at the cast. The interesting thing they did with this movie is they filled the front end of The Dirty Dozen with known actors and actors who've got a lot of agency. You've got John Cassevetes as Franco, you've got Telly Savalas playing Maggot, a religious nut who is incredibly misogynistic. You've got Posey, played by Clint Walker. You've got Donald Sutherland playing Pinkley, and it's a breakthrough role for Donald Sutherland. Before that, he was a Canadian actor doing TV roles in England. And this is the movie that got him the role in MASH, so it's very much a breakthrough role for Donald Sutherland. You got Trini Lopez, who was known mostly as a singer, and who actually left the movie early because the movie went way over schedule. And Trini Lopez just jumped out of the movie about 3 months after he was supposed to finish it. And so his character ended up hanging in a tree with his neck broken as they do the raid, which is the reason why you don't see him in the later parts of the film. And as always, the battery just died on the camera, and I've had to replace it. You have Jim Brown playing Jefferson, one of the 12, and you also have Charles Bronson playing Vladislav, and he's kind of interesting too. Charles Bronson had been an actor for 15 years at this stage, not really getting too much traction, but between this and Once Upon a Time in the West and a few other films, he broke free of his previous career and in the 1970s became very, very successful. So really good bunch of tough guy actors. Cassevetes, who was more a director than an actor, even though he had done things like a TV series called Johnny Staccato in the late 1950s and early 1960s. He really wanted to direct his own projects. And the way that the producers got him to do The Dirty Dozen was to tell him, well, look, take the money and make your next movie with the money that we're going to give you. which indeed he did. He made a very fine film of his own back called Faces, with Seymour Cassel amongst other people in it. So this movie gave forward, in a sense, to other movies. The ensemble just works. I mean, even the military officers, you've got, of course, Lee Marvin, who was himself a Marine and was injured in the Battle of Saipan when a bullet took out his sciatic nerve. And he really knew firsthand about being in the military, and also about the ugliness of war, because the Battle of Saipan was an incredibly brutal engagement in the Pacific during World War II. You've got Robert Ryan, who was also in the military. You've got Ernest Borgnine. You've got George Kennedy, a whole bunch of other people who had first-hand knowledge of this stuff were a part of the movie. And you've got a few other character actors in there, like Richard Jekyll. And the movie does have that beautiful escalation. We meet this ragtag bunch of people. We see them build their own camp and start their training and do their training. You get an idea of who most of the characters are, even though there are a few actors who don't get too much oxygen because they're minor roles. And you see them come together as a team, and also you realise that these guys are incredibly resourceful. They're not they're not people who follow rules very well, and that self-reliance, in a sense, makes them very, very good at guerrilla warfare. Then you get the mission itself, which is an attack on a chateau full of German officers behind enemy lines just before D-Day, and the whole idea is to just basically mess shit up. Take out as many officers as you can, blow the place up, and get away if you possibly can, which not many of them actually do. And the chateau itself is a really nice set. It's an enormous set that they built on location and blew up on purpose. Of course they blew it up on purpose, it was part of a movie. But it really does work well. There's a couple of scenes where Charles Bronson and Lee Marvin have to invade the chateau pretending to be German officers, and that's got a certain tension to it. Aldrich was a great action director. He'd already made Flight of the Phoenix a couple of years earlier, and that was very, very successful. This one works really well as far as the action's concerned, as far as the characters are concerned, and as far as this very straight through plot line of the narrative. But there's also some humour in there as well. You could have made this movie dead serious and kind of almost documentary style, but Aldrich didn't do that. There are some humorous things to do with an army major played by Robert Ryan. Really fine character actor, Robert Ryan. I've never seen him bad in anything he's done. And he's playing a very kind of by-the-book officer who kind of gets messed up by his engagement with the Dirty Dozen. And you also get some nice bits where the guys get a feast just before the mission, and some very special guests turn up in the huts the night before the mission. I kind of like that bit too, because it humanises these characters who otherwise would be seen as just human trash. It does give, well, at least most of them, a humanity which is kind of respectful. Criminals are human beings, whether people like to think that or not. And these guys are humanised by the skill of the actors, of course, the script, and by the fact that Robert Aldrich wanted to go there with those particular characters. Now, at the time this movie came out, it was very, very controversial, because the prevailing narrative in World War II movies were that all of the soldiers on the Allied side during the war were heroes. And then they come along with this bunch of kind of psychotic, mad people doing this crazy mission where they do commit war crimes. And that wasn't something which some members of the audience and some critics liked. They were too used to the heroic narrative of World War II movies. And this movie doesn't do that. It says that wars are won by bastards, basically. And that there are crimes committed even by what are perceived as the good guys at a war. And that we can't ignore that. And we can't ignore the fact that war, of its very nature, is a brutal, ugly, bloody, nasty business. And this movie has the honesty to show that. Now, there were a couple of sequels made to The Dirty Dozen, but you can pretty much ignore them. If you're a completist, you can watch them, but they're not necessarily going to add too much to what you get in the first one. But for me, this one works really well. There were a couple of different movies around this time which did have a kind of different narrative about the war. There was a movie with Burt Lancaster called Castle Keep, which I recommend you check out as well. But The Dirty Dozen, it's satisfying as an adventure film, it's satisfying as a war film, but it's not a Pollyanna, hooray, wave the flag kind of war movie. It's a little more honest than a lot of war movies were at the time, and it gains extra respect from me for that. I think it's a really nice revisit for me. I enjoyed thoroughly watching it. I recommend you get the Blu-ray, and I'll put a link in the descriptions here, because there are some great extras. There are a couple of documentary bits, short features, which were done at the time the movie was made. There's a history of one of the groups that inspired the making of The Dirty Dozen, a group of Army Rangers during World War II called the Filthy 13. And they interviewed some of the guys who were on that, and they were crazy but mad heroic guys who did some extraordinary things to help the war effort during World War II, particularly in the Ardennes Forest and around the Battle of the Bulge, which makes an interesting addition to the history. So there's a documentary attached to the Blu-ray. There's also the usual commentary tracks and a couple of other bits and pieces, and also, which has surprised me a little bit, there's a Marine training video that features Lee Marvin talking about leadership in the Marines. And it's the last piece of film that Lee Marvin did before he died in 1987. And that's kind of interesting too. There's just so much, even the fairly cheap version that I got on Blu-ray, there are just so many extras there. And it reminded me again why physical media is important. If you go on a streaming service, you're not going to get all these extras. You're not going to get all this nuance. You're not going to get the history of what happened. And a lot of these kind of things that fill out the world in which a movie is made and the influences that caused it to be made. So definitely physical media has an advantage over streaming for that very reason. And The Dirty Dozen, the Blu-ray of that, really does demonstrate this in a wonderful way. Now, that's pretty much it for this movie. I enjoyed revisiting it a lot. Now, a couple of things on the channel. I'm kind of semi-planning another 24-hour movie marathon. So if you have any ideas what you want me to do for that 24-hour movie marathon, what kind of movies you'd like me to suffer through while I'm doing that, I'd be really happy to take your comments on that. Let me know whether you enjoyed The Dirty Dozen or whether you had problems with it, and any other of those World War II movies that you found were really fun to watch, but a little more complex than the normal run-of-the-mill flag-waving kind of films. It really is a bit of an underrated movie, and I think it's a lot more complex film than a lot of people at the time it was made recognized. So anyway, thank you very much for watching. As usual, stay safe, wear a mask, follow the science, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, watch a few war movies, and I'll see you next time.